The Supreme Court in Bangladesh scales back a government jobs quota. Protests against the controversial policy led to a nationwide curfew, killings, and a communications blackout. So, will this move appease angry students? And what's behind the recurring unrest? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. After weeks of widespread unrest in Bangladesh, the Supreme Court has changed a controversial quota system for government jobs. It's significantly reduced the share of public sector positions reserved for war veterans' family members. But despite the ruling, the protests appear to be far from over. Initially student-led, they've grown to include people frustrated by rising inflation and high food prices. Dozens of student leaders, activists, and opposition figures have been arrested. With soldiers on the streets, a nationwide curfew is in place and a communications blackout. There are also growing calls for Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to take accountability. So what does this mean for her government? And will the quota reforms be enough to restore calm? We'll explore these issues with our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Katia Lopez-Hodoyan.
The Supreme Court in Bangladesh appears to have listened to tens of thousands of angry students. After weeks of demonstrations and police crackdowns, the top court scaled back a quota system for government jobs. The protests began in early July after the reinstatement of a controversial policy which reserved more than half of government jobs for minorities and relatives of veterans who fought for independence in 1971. Now the court has reduced that share from 56% to 7%.
That means 93% of the quota will be for the general public, 5% for freedom fighters and their relatives, 1% for ethnic minorities and 1% for transgender and physically disabled applicants.
Initially led by students, the protests grew to include people frustrated with high inflation and rising food prices. The government deployed the army to enforce a nationwide curfew and cut mobile and internet services to ensure security, it said. More than 100 people have been killed, thousands injured.
People were killed and tortured. They were killed with our government's permission as they called for reforms to the quota system. The state should take responsibility.
It is a matter of common sense that more than 50% of the jobs cannot be given away to quota holders. A normal state cannot be run like this.
The unrest points to a wider frustration with the governing Awami League. 7 months ago, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina won a fifth-term in elections, critics described as a sham. The opposition boycotted the vote, accusing her of corruption and suppressing dissent. About 20,000 opposition activists were arrested. But this time, the government says it invited students to talks.
Students who are against the quota, we welcome them and put their proposals up for discussion. Our Honourable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina also welcomes their input.
Government supporters point to the economic transformation under Hasina's leadership, which has lifted millions of people out of poverty. Despite that, nearly 20% of the population is out of work or school. And Hasina's government is facing a new pushback led by a younger generation. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining us from Sydney is Mubashar Hasan, a political analyst and post-doctoral fellow at the University of Oslo. In Athens, Ohio, Mohammed Ashraf Zaman is an exiled Bangladeshi human rights activist and researcher at Ohio University. And in New Delhi, we have Srirada Datta, a professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Her research focuses on Bangladesh-India relations. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Mubashar, let me start with you today. Bangladesh's Supreme Court has scaled back this controversial quota system, but it did not abolish it. Will this ruling be satisfactory to all the students who've been protesting and demanding an end to this system?
So I think there will be, we can only say what would be the exact reaction of the student once the communication blackout would be lifted, the press blackout that would be lifted, and so forth. So, but it seems to me that that quota movement would not be confined within just about quota anymore, because there are a lot of young kids have been shot dead. There are a lot of young kids who demanded a rightful demand to their estate, were traumatized, ended up injured in hospitals, and also some of them are forcefully disappeared and then only to be returned, and so forth. So I think there will be a lot of anger, frustration, resentment. So this quota movement, I do not think it is confined in quota movement anymore.
And Mubashar, if I could just follow up with you and ask you, what are some of the other root causes of the anger that's being displayed in these protests?
So first of all, this is a young generation who I call Generation Z. And a large portion of young generation were not being able to cast their vote. So there is a disconnection between the state and this young generation, who are millions in numbers. And they saw that when they raised their demand, there is a group of civilians who work in tandem with law enforcement agencies attack them. It happened during the road safety movement, it happened during the previous quota movement, and it happened now again. So there is a sense that they are not really being able to pursue their demand, and the state is really listening to them. We need to be mindful that before this mindless violence and this chaotic situation, this whole problem is created by the government. I mean, it was kind of settled previously during the previous quota movement, which took place in 2018. And then suddenly it was brought back and reintroduced. And before this events turned deadly, they were ridiculed, they were intimidated, they were bullied by the rhetorics by Prime Minister, rhetoric by Law Minister, and so forth. And then, it just went out of control.
Sri Radha, I saw you reacting to what Mubashar was saying there. It looked like you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
Yeah, it's right now, as we see it, I mean, the tempers, of course, are over the quota movement. We've also seen a Supreme Court, change the numbers drastically. But I mean, I completely agree with what Mubashar is saying, that it's a accumulation of many other factors, not only the previous quota movement, really, but the kind of, I think the government hasn't addressed many of the problems the youth and the youngsters are facing right now. The highest level of unemployment. But at the same time, if you see, the government has been completely lackadaisical about the kind of high level of corruption, flight of money, all that doesn't escape them. And here they are. And, you're completely diluting meritocracy in the in this nation, and giving chances to children on a very, very unfair platform. And also, of course, there again, the January elections were something that the students didn't feel very happy about. There are many first-time voters who are very disappointed, and not only this election, even the previous election. So it's anger, resentment, which has grown over the years with suddenly. And that point that he made, that while they were protesting, they've done this earlier, it's not the first time. The reaction by the government was unprecedented. It's very unfair and certainly very derogatory, which spilled this. And then, of course, we saw the very high-handed way the government, tried to take charge. So all of that has really added to this very, very difficult and hostile situation on the ground.
So, Sri Radha, it sounds to me as though you and Mubashar are saying that these protests that may have started out as against the quota system, that perhaps they have coalesced around an anti-government message. Would you say that these now have become anti-government demonstrations?
I would think so. I certainly would think so, because the resentment was building. I mean, there were many other small, incidents which were brought to light. But again, as I said, the government wasn't addressing them. And the students felt that many of what they were asking for, what they were demanding, were completely ignored and denied. So I think this was that particular moment when all the temples just were, they were really heckled at this point. Yeah.
Zaman, from your perspective, will the student protesters be satisfied with this decision from the Supreme Court? Is it enough that there will just be a reform of the quota system, or do they want to see it completely abolished?
Thank you very much for having me. What I would say that, first of all, the Supreme Court has to say, tell to the people very explicitly that what do they mean by this, because the Supreme Court's two tiers, the High Court division in the past, it granted the quota system to be reinstated, and then now the appellate division is saying completely a different way, but at the same time it is also giving the authority to the government that if the government wants, it can keep it, it can, whatever they want to do with the quota system, they can exercise their discretion. So in that case, in one hand, it is empowering the government to make its own decision. And if Sheikh Hasina's government remains in office, then you don't know, because the same government in 2018, they publicly declared that the quota system will be abolished, and it was reinstated, using the Supreme Court. And in Bangladesh also, I need to say this, that the people have very high distrust on the judiciary because of his absence of independence. And we can also cite many examples that the judiciary as a whole is not independent. So in this case, I don't think that the people and the protesters in general will be trusting the court's ruling, and that will bring the protest to an end.
Zaman, if I could also just ask you, what are some of the other demands from the student leaders in this protest movement so far?
The protest movement, they have some 8 specific demands that the people there were involved in killing the protesters. They should be identified and investigated, and that includes the members of the law enforcement agencies, the members of the ruling party, student wing in particular, the Bangladesh Chhatra League, who escorted with the police. They came up to attack the male and female protesters very brutally with the sharp and blunt weapons and also firearms. They also demanded that the killing that has been unleashed by the government has to be ended, and a complete probe has to be there, and the detained people has to be released. And all the fabricated cases that has been there, it has to be resolved. So they have a lot of other demands on that. And of course, the bringing the quota system to the minimum, like according to the Constitution, in line with the realistic requirement of the underprivileged people who deserve a quota system, not according to the relationship with a particular group of people.
Mubashar, protesters are now also demanding the resignation of Sheikh Hasina. How much pressure is she currently under, and what does this turmoil mean for the prospect of her longer-term rule?
So, there are a group of people, there are groups in the society, they have been voicing this concern for a while. I think what this quota movement has done is that it kind of underpin the legitimacy crisis for the Prime Minister here. It was quite evident through the reaction of the government to this protester that by calling them Rajakars, which is very derogatory term and kind of underpin anti-national element or anti-state element. It goes back to the history of Bangladesh's independence war. It effectively shows to many protesters from the videos that I gathered is that this prime minister is not prime minister for everyone, which she needed to show that, she's the prime minister for everyone, including the people who holds different opinion. So there is this legitimacy crisis, I think, which is going to run deep in this society, even though the whole thing is now framed about this High Court rule. We need to underpin that there are like over 130 people dead. They have families, they have their relatives, social and wider social connections. What will happen to those deaths? We don't even know. And this sense of grievances is very problematic in a country which is full of young people. If you look into the demography of Bangladesh, as Sriradha Datta said, that, there are a lot of people are unemployed. And also there are, most people in Bangladesh didn't born before 1971 war now. But this government has been, it is a defining word for the nation state, and obviously it is important. But it is quite painful to see that if someone practices their legitimate right to protest, they will be identified as someone who acted against the state during 1971 war. And, that whole war narrative, what is the point of war narrative after 50 years of independence? We should invest our time, energy, money, and politics in rebuilding and progressing the country. So that grievances would be a problem for some time and for longer time. And finally, I want to underpin that the videos I've seen, the state authorities have lost their legitimacy too, in a way that, protesters really didn't care about and show respect to the police anymore. That's really problematic. So what the state is doing now, they are forcefully trying to asserting fear, and which kind of acted as an
Mubashar,
effective tool in the.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's just that I do see Sriradha, and she is reacting to what you're saying, so I want to give her a chance to jump in as well. But also, Sriradha, I want to ask you about the fact that there's soldiers on the streets, there's a nationwide curfew that's been in place, communications blackout. There are also growing calls for Sheikh Hasina to take accountability. Do you think that's going to happen? Because Mubashar was just saying that she and her government, that they're having a legitimacy crisis. I mean, how do you see this playing out?
I agree with this, and I just recently, just a couple of hours ago, saw a 9-point demand by Abdul Qadir, who's one of the leaders of the anti-protesters team. And, the first thing that they listed out was that they want an apology from the Prime Minister about what has happened and the way the government has, used repression so harshly and strongly. And, of course, resignation of Abdul Qadir, another minister, and, basically accountability. I completely agree that the students want a systemic change. This is through the Quota issue that they've raised these issues, but they have, I think, they're very, very exasperated with the way that the country has moved in the last couple of years. While it has done wonders in many ways, we've seen how till about a year and a half ago, it was, its GDP was rising, growing, the fastest growing nation in Asia. And from there, the way the economic conditions have really, really gone down the rabbit hole, if I may use the expression. And it's always falls on the youth. It's always, and if you look at the way things have, and it's all in the public domain, despite the kind of harsh censorship of the media and the civil society, and even in the NGO sector, which has actually been a very, very robust sector in Bangladesh and has contributed to Bangladesh's growth story. Despite that, we've seen how this government has used every tool possible in their hands to come down on any voice, any act which doesn't completely align with themselves with the particular political party in play. So all of that is, I think, a kind of a part of the boil that we see just now on the streets. And I think that's a valid point that, they're not scared of the security forces. Of course, it's curfew just now, but whatever little information and videos, we saw that they were willing to face the tanks, they're willing to face. We've seen some helicopters and some dust emanating. So I'm really not sure what kind of measures that were being used, but clearly the government was not even open to a dialogue at this point of time, which they could have reached out. They were using, trying to control it through, security apparatus, which clearly was not working.
Zaman, do you believe there's going to be growing calls for Sheikh Hasina to resign? And do you think that that is a scenario that is in any way possible given the current climate in Bangladesh?
Of course, it won't be a call. It is the call of this hour. And you need to see Sheikh Hasina and her legacy. For example, how do we trust Sheikh Hasina when there have been over 700 enforced disappearances during her regime since January 2009? There are nearly 3,000 extrajudicial executions under Sheikh Hasina. And none of these cases have been investigated or the victims have given an universal access to justice in the country. And then you look at the non-state actors' violence like these ruling parties, student wings, and their other goons. They're attacking people all the time. And state is very systematically using these forces. Then you see the kleptocracy that Sheikh Hasina has established in a Russian oligarchy system, that there are a couple of privileged businessmen or the companies, they grab all the institutions, as many as possible. And now the Grameen Bank, for example, founded by Professor Mohammed Yunus, has been their target to come under their control. So, and then you are disenfranchising the population, for example, around 30 million people who have been 18 years old during the regime of Sheikh Hasina. They have never given a chance to cast their vote. We see that according to the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics information, there have been 2.5 million, 90,000 unemployed people, educated unemployed people in Bangladesh. And the youth unemployment rate is over 80%. So that includes the Sheikh Hasina. I mean, whatever development that people talk about Sheikh Hasina, you also need to see the picture quite fairly, that whether there has been any justice given or the government has ever shown its attitude that it has any system of political or judicial accountability in the country. So if the answer is a no, then Sheikh Hasina's time is over and she must go as immediately as possible. That's what I feel that people are demanding at the moment.
Mubashar, dozens of student leaders, activists, and opposition figures have been arrested. How much has that exacerbated the situation?
That exacerbated the situation quite badly because, one, as I mentioned before, fear has been the key tool of suppressing opinion, but it was like a pressure cooker situation. It was bound to happen someday. And people, the reaction of the students are so fearless so far. That kind of will aggravate the situation further. And I think what is going to take place is that there is no justification of 130 people being dead over a demand that, the student wanted a fairer access to the government service job. That's as simple as that, right? And that situation led to something that shows that, this is an incapacity of managing a state in a compassionate manner. And Bangladesh is a small country geographically, but it's a huge country population-wise. And the way that economy and everything is being shut down, I think, those arrests and those repression on the students are going to linger from this point forward.
Srirada, critics have described the last election in Bangladesh that Sheikh Hasina won as a sham. The opposition of Bangladesh boycotted the vote. They accused her government of corruption. They accused her government of suppressing dissent. What has all this done when it comes to Sheikh Hasina's standing in the international community?
Well, so far as some of her partners are concerned, it's India and China. I think they have been pretty much supportive. We have seen the USA certainly, raise issues. But again, so far as Europe and other states are concerned, I don't think they have. They had raised some concerns before the elections, but surprisingly, post-election, one was, surprised to see that not too many are making any sounds about that. I would think that's rather unfortunate, really. And USA, as you know, I think it's known their reaction has been quite quiet post the election. There has been some, points here and there, really, but not the way they had initially was trying to ensure that a multi-party free democratic election should be held. But when that wasn't the case, I didn't see anybody really come out very strongly against what Bangladesh was doing.
And Sri Radha, we only have a couple of minutes left, but let me just ask you, do you think that we could start seeing any anti-India sentiment in Bangladesh? I ask because the public believes that India remains Sheikh Hasina's strongest backer. So does this start taking a turn into anger also being expressed towards India?
In fact, post the elections, we did see, though it was a social media movement confined largely there to that level, didn't pick up any momentum for, other than that, which was called the Quit India, where they didn't want to buy the essential goods that do come into Bangladesh on a daily basis and that kind of thing. But, we know the close proximity. We understand the historical relation that Awami League shares with India. So, and anything does, and it's not just now. I mean, we've seen that in the past too, that whenever there's some anger and resentment about Awami League and Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, it tends to have a negative impact on India because of the close proximity, really, because this is one political party that India has worked with very closely from 1971 onwards. And that certainly, and every time something goes wrong, there's a natural tendency amongst the youth and the public at large, not only the youth, public at large, to blame India for. I mean, the perception is that way, rightly or wrongly.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Mubashar Hasan, Mohammed Ashraf Bangladeshi, and Sri Radha Datta. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.